Hey, excellent. Thank you. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to Vancouver DevOps Meetup. My name is Andrzej Kamiński, and together with Willie, Ilse, and Martin, I'm co-organizer of this meetup. So something that started as DevOps, which is a combination of culture, automation, lean, agile processes, metrics, and recovery, over time grew into the entire library of acronyms. So we've got today DevSecOps, we've got the Data Ops, GitOps, Machine Learning Ops, AI Ops, Cloud Ops, and of course we've got NoOps. And today we'll be talking about APIOps. So I don't think there is a developer in the world that wouldn't use API. So there is a lot of benefits, obviously, like integration, modularity, and scalability, efficiency, and so on. But it also comes with a lot of challenges that requires a holistic approach to the API management. And the API development lifecycle is actually very similar to most of the software development life cycles. So it will be really interesting to hear how APIOps differs from other flavors. So Martin, over to you to provide some information about housekeeping and to introduce the speaker.
Well, thank you, Andrzej. And before we begin with our main attraction, a few housekeeping notes. This session is being recorded and will be shared on our Meetup YouTube channel in a month's time. So please mute your microphones when not talking. And remember, we need your feedback to improve the Meetup and your ideas for future sessions. So please provide those to us as best you can. For our main attraction, Fernando Roca is a senior cloud solution architect at Microsoft, specializing in process innovation, including full stack cloud, DevOps, and enterprise integration. For the last 10 years of his 15 years experience in IT, Fernando has been helping teams modernize and innovate their solutions in the cloud. Fernando, the virtual floor is all yours.
And before we start, we'll have a question and answers at the end. So if you could just hold to the questions or post them in the meantime in the chat.
Yes, awesome. Thank you, Andrzej. And off to you, Fernando.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction, Martin, Andrzej, Willie. Thank you so much for having me here at UC2, right? It's very nice to get this invitation. I'm always happy to talk about DevOps. Well, I'm always happy to talk about software development lifecycle, right? It's one of my passions. So thank you so much for having me here today. If you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen then. Just want to get a thumbs up if you can see it. Good? All right. So I was kindly introduced already, so thank you so much for that. But yes, my name is Fernando Rocha. I am a cloud solution architect at Microsoft. My job today is to help customers all around Canada and globally sometimes to build their solutions the best way possible using Azure. Currently, out of my 15 years of experience in IT, I have spent most of them using cloud providers to build my solutions and help people build their solutions. And I have a lot of topics that are really dear and that I'm very fond of. And DevOps, for sure, it's one of them. It's my first time in this meetup here. I have been in Vancouver for 4 years, and I have been working heavily with DevOps for the past year and a half at Microsoft. So I'll make sure to join from now on every month, because I was able to see the best meetups there, and they look very exciting. So again, thank you so much for having me here today. A couple of notes about myself. I love to write, I love to speak engagement. This is one of the presentations that I'm planning to do over and over again. It's the first time that I'm doing it, right? I think it's a topic that has been pretty popular for a while now. There's a little bit of a history associated to it that I'm going to tell you about. How did we get to APIOps? I feel like that DevOps always has a history behind it, right? You have always a situation that happened until you reach your DevOps state, right? It doesn't matter what it is. If it's robust or not, you have a history that you need to follow to get there until you start using DevOps in the beginning of your solutions on a day-to-day basis. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the APIOps story. And since the first time that I'm giving this presentation, I would really like some very comprehensive feedback of it. If you would like to, you can give it in the forum that's going to be shared with you later. But it will also help me a lot if you could connect me with me on LinkedIn if you want to, or take a look at my GitHub repo there. I have a lot of interesting things going on. I love to write about technologies. I love to share personal experiences and customer stories, create tutorials. So if you're looking for some content related to cloud, take a look at my LinkedIn page, that there's a lot there. So let's get to the interesting part, right? We're here to talk about how to automate API deployments with APIOps. As I mentioned before, getting to APIOps is not something that you just get there, right? It's not there when you start working with APIs. The need of an APIOps strategy is not there, right? And people usually confuse building backends as a part of an APIOps strategy, right? But no, APIOps is a process that is involved in the API management process, right? When you have a lot of APIs, you need to manage them in a centralized location. That's where APIOps comes in, right? Because once you start deploying a lot of your APIs and managing them in a centralized location, you need to understand how DevOps fits in this picture. And that's where APIOps comes in. Okay, I'm going to talk about a lot. I'm going to talk a lot about that. So hopefully you have a much better understanding what I'm talking about at the end of this presentation. That's my goal. But let's start in the beginning. What overall is an API? As developers, right, I believe we're here, we're in multiple stages in our career. But let's say that an API, the dictionary definition of an API is that an API is a mechanism that enables two software components to communicate with each other using a set of definitions and protocols. How do we translate that to something that's easier to understand? You have a system A and a system B. They need to communicate with each other, and there are tons of ways that they can do that. One of them is by using APIs. They come up with a particular protocol that they both agree that they're going to use, and one start calling the other one using that particular protocol. That protocol, that set of definitions, it's when encapsulated, it becomes an API for you to use. That's a very simple representation of what an API is, right? But the best way to understand it is just a set of definitions and protocols that systems agree to use to communicate with each other. And APIs exist for a reason, right? As I say here, at first there was data. There's data somewhere, right? And when there's data, someone needs that data to do something with it. So that's a scenario that you've probably seen before. If you're new to your career in IT and you haven't seen it yet, you will at some point, right? Let's say you're working in your company and you have a database and it has pretty cool data that you generated yourself. You love your data, it's the best data ever, and you use it for amazing things. The thing is, if your data is so amazing, people will start asking for it. You have someone asking for access to your data constantly, right? And the way that you provide access to that data, again, can be multiple things. But we're talking about APIs here today. You build an API for that particular person. You say, hey, this is the API, this is how you use it. Good luck, get my data, whatever you want with it. Now, if that person really likes your data, someone else will hear about it. And they will also ask for that data. So they're going to keep asking, hey, what about me? Can I have access to your data? Sure, of course. Here's an API for you to use. This is how you use it. Good luck. Now, this can snowball really quickly, right? You can get a lot of people from different areas of your company requesting for access to that data. And at that point, you will have problems. And here are some of the problems that you will have if you create an approach where you keep creating APIs or adding people to your API pool to have access to it without a lot of control. First issues that you'll see right away are backend scalability issues. Okay, that SQL Server database from 2008 that you have all of your cool data in, maybe it's not ready to receive 1,000 connections per day requesting for data using very heavy queries that trigger a lot of stored procedures in your environment. And maybe your API itself is not able to scale that quickly to the amount of connectivities that it has, right? It's much more expensive to scale a database than it is an API. So there is some cost involved in it, there is some operational involved in it, and there is some efficiency that gets, well, efficiency that gets detrimented, right? There's that detriment to it if you keep using things without a lot of control. Another problem that you may have is access control. If you have one API or a set of APIs and you have a lot of people using that API, it's a shared API, you don't know who's using those credentials, right? Maybe you're authorizing access to your API in a way that you should not be doing. And that API key that you created is being shared by multiple people. You don't know who's using your API. And that creates a lot of data confidentiality problems, meaning that maybe you have personal identifiable data in that database. Maybe you have some PCI components there. Maybe you have some intellectual property. You may have a lot of different things there that can create problems for you. You can have a lot of data leaks that you shouldn't have when you start dealing with APIs like you're doing like this. Another problem that you may have is cost. As your environment scales, if it scales, right, you may have a lot of cost associated to it that you may not be able to control, right, properly. Can you give me just 1 second? Just 1 second here. Sorry.
Fernando must be chasing his cat once again.
Really sorry, everyone. Having a cat at the house and being alone in the house sometimes is complicated. Sorry. So cost is there as a problem, meaning that sometimes you have an environment that scales automatically, or worse, it doesn't. And there is a lot of cost associated to it, right? But not only that, who should pay for that cost? If people are benefiting from your SQL Server data or any other database that you want to use, maybe they should be paying for it, right? And is it fair for user A that's accessing your API once a day to pay the same amount of money that someone that's accessing 1,000 times a day is paying for? Maybe they should pay different prices, right? Cost becomes an issue. Development practices, another problem, right? You may want to create some standards on how to access your API, how to use it, how to process the data associated to it, okay? How to add caching if needed. That's very hard to do when you don't have a centralized location to manage that, because you're gonna need to manage it case-by-case basis, or worse, if you have one API for everybody, you're gonna have a lot of conditions inside your code to manage all of those people, okay? Last one, from an operations perspective, it's very hard to manage APIs, okay, if you don't have a centralized location to collect the metrics that they are generating, okay, and create analysis, create some analytics reports on top of it that can give you comprehensive information on how to act, on how to improve your API for your customers, and a lot more, okay? So what can you do to mitigate all of these issues? So you need to enforce some standards. That's basically what you need to do. You need to enforce some standards at some point. And enforce is highlighted for a reason here. We don't like the use enforce. We don't like the word enforce. We don't like it's a harsh word, right? But it's a very good word here. And the reason why people don't like enforcing change is because changing can be a bad thing if it's not done correctly. If you're changing your environment, if you're making sure that people are using your API in a way that it's very complicated for them to apply the changes to your API, to use the APIs properly, it can become a little complicated to make sure that everybody agrees with the changes that are in place. You need to make sure that you create a process that is comprehensive enough for people to do the minimum possible, right, to get that process going properly, without having any problems on our day-to-day activities. And the way that we do that, we all know about DevOps already here, but the way that you do that is usually with some DevOps practices, right? You guarantee that everything that you're pushing to production, you guarantee that everything that you're creating, it has some standards associated to it in an automated way. So the answer to this is, in this particular case as well, even when you're managing APIs, is automation. Okay, if you're able to make sure that, if you're able to guarantee that your standards are being enforced in a seamless way, making sure that all of the actors that are involved in your API creation process are only doing necessary work to apply the new principles to their day-to-day work without having to do repeatable tasks over and over again, without having comprehensive documentation, small but very comprehensive documentation to follow, you're going to have problems, right? And the reason why we apply principles like API management, like DevOps, is not because we want to create problems. We want to solve problems. We're fixing them. So that applies to API management as well. So the next stage we have in our timeline is sharing is caring, right? You share your data because you care about people, but you must do it right, okay? An API for a lot of people, it's only a backend with a lot of code that is deployed somewhere and has an endpoint that you collect information from, right? But what is a well-managed API? A well-managed API has a few pieces associated to it that compose the API lifecycle process, right? I don't have a slide here that details the API lifecycle, development lifecycle process, but because it's not the idea here. But an API itself, it has a few features that help achieve a mature lifecycle. And the first one of them, and maybe the most important one because it is related to discoverability, is the API specification. API specification can be a WSDL file if we're talking about a SOAP API. It can be a GraphQL representation of an API. It can be an OpenAI specification, a Swagger file for you to use and understand what that API has, what that API is, and how to use it properly. The next thing that an API needs to have to be well managed are policies. And how do you use policies? You use policies in many different ways. If you think about something that you want to add to your API, there's probably a policy out of the box for you to use, or you need to build one, but it's still feasible to build one. Right? And policies are used when you want to cache data that you get from APIs, when you want to validate JOT tokens if needed, when you want to transform the response from an older SOAP API from XML to JSON files to handle, let's say, mobile applications, to facilitate that response handling for mobile applications. All of that can be facilitated a lot by using policies and much, much, much more. I'll show you more or less what type of policies we have. You understand the realm of policies that you're capable of adding there. Third is security. You need to make sure that you're authenticating correctly, that you're authorizing correctly, that you're making sure that only people from specific places can access your APIs. That's all inside an API management solution as well. And then monitoring and analytics. You need to be able to collect metrics associated to your APIs, of course. And metrics are not without very well done analytics on top of those metrics, right? With proper analytics, you understand, you will have a better process to understand how to improve your APIs to your customers, right? What is working and what is not. So those are the 5 pieces that I believe compose a well-managed API in an API management solution. And good thing is Azure has a great solution for API management called Azure API Management, right? We give very, very good names to the products here because you actually know what they mean, right? And what they do, so it's pretty cool. We have a couple of pieces in this diagram here that I want to explore. It's a pretty simple diagram, but basically what you have when you have APIs is you have producers and consumers, right? And by producers and consumers, you have 2 separate pieces for each one of them. First of all, you have data and services. This can be a database, it can be IoT applications, it can be mobile devices, it can be satellites, it can be applications running on servers, it can be applications running on the cloud, it doesn't matter. You have data that people are interested in. And people who own that data are people responsible for them, right? They're people from the API teams. They are responsible for building the APIs that are going to allow access to this particular data, all right? The second piece that we have, what we're calling here connected experience, are the applications who are going to be accessing, collecting data from this data and services here. And they do this through APIs that were built by API teams. And the teams who are responsible for this connected experience, we call them application developers. They're the ones who are using the API. Now, imagine that you have one API, okay? And you have one API here, you have a lot of people using it, it's working quite well. Imagine that you have a solution that has an enormous number of APIs coming from different domains, right, and doing different things. When you give that set of APIs to developers, it's pretty hard for them to manage all of those endpoints, all of those ways to connect, all of those ways to authenticate and authorize, all those ways to understand how these APIs work, because they are spread around multiple places. And that's where Azure API management comes along. Okay, Azure API management is going to give you a centralized location, okay, that will again centralize the API pieces from its lifecycle into one single location that you can access in the Azure portal using the CLIs, using the APIs, etc. But it has three main pieces, right, that we need to understand. The first one, and maybe the most important one for some people, is the developer portal. The developer portal is the most important one for application developers. That's where they're going to see the API specifications for the APIs that they can use. They are going to learn how to subscribe to those APIs, how much they cost, if there's a price associated to it, what type of authentication authorization mechanisms they need to use there, what type of requests and response they can send and expect back. Okay, that's what the developer portal is. You have the gateway. The gateway is a centralized location where all of your data flows through. So every single request and response from the connected experience all the way to the data and services, before they hit the API backend itself, they go through the API gateway, managed by Azure or managed by you, if you choose to do it on your own. That API gateway can be deployed as a container, Kubernetes, Docker, whatever you want to use, right? And you can scale it in your own way, deploy it whatever you want, etc. But Azure also can manage that for you if you choose to do so, or an easier approach. And that gateway, again, is responsible for handle all of the traffic associated to that API and to apply all of those policies that you create for every single one of those APIs. Okay? So that's where the gateway comes into place. The third one is the admin portal. And the admin portal, I'm going to show it to you in a minute, is the Azure portal where you create your APIs, you create your API experiences, you add policies, you add logs, you add security, you add everything that is involved in the API lifecycle, okay, in a centralized location, which is the admin portal. As I mentioned before, every single thing that you want to do in the admin portal, you can also do through the CLI and through REST APIs. Okay, let me give you an understanding of just a quick overview of that API management pipeline. I have something here. Okay, I can live with it. So the first thing that we're going to be seeing here is the API management portal. Okay, the API management portal, I'm not going to go too deep into it, okay, because there's a lot to go over here. But overall, the API management, as I mentioned before, is a centralized location where you would manage all of your APIs. You would create, again, you would add security, you would add it to products, subscriptions, you would add secure values here. There's a lot that you can do here, okay? But we're going to focus on only two pieces. The first piece is where the APIs are located. So you can define new APIs here if you want to. Right now, I have two APIs. I have one that's called Echo API, and I have another one that's called Star Wars API that I created manually here just to show you. okay? And every single one of them, you can add policies to it, right? So I can have different policies being added here, like I can filter IP addresses, I can mock responses, I can validate content, I can validate job tokens, I can cache responses, I can set parameters, I can change data that comes in, that goes to the backend and comes to the backend, from the backend back to the user. There's a lot that you can do with policies here, right? So if you want to see all of the policies that we have available for you, you just come scroll here. There are a lot, and you can also do custom policies if you want. Okay, all of them are highly customizable. You can code on top of these policies. You can do conditions. It's pretty flexible what you can and cannot do. All right. Now, on the API itself, another good visualization that you have that is generated for you here is the Open API specification, right? I'm going to go through what you see here in a few moments, but right now I want to show you an Open API specification for you to look at. So I'm on Visual Studio Code right now, and Visual Studio Code gives me, you can download and install an extension that's called Open API extension that will let you see Open API specifications on Visual Studio Code, right? So if you have a specification document in YAML or JSON file, you can see it. So that's basically one of the features that people see in the developer portal when they start using Azure API management. But basically what you see here is a representation of the API, the operations that you have, the parameters that you need to call, the responses that it generates, the return codes, everything is here. Okay? Perfect. Now, let's go back to the presentation. Now you see that Azure API management right now is a process that is a service, right? Is a service. It is a service that is within Azure. And how does this affect DevOps processes? You have an Azure service. You need to think about having multiple environments: development, QA, production, staging, pre-production, whatever you want to call it, right? Maybe you have two environments, development and production. That's enough for a lot of people. I've seen people who have 5 or 6 different environments for their processes, right? But you want to have them. After you create your APIs on API management and test them, how do you move them to production? What is the best process to do it? You just copy what you did there manually and repeat the same processes in a production environment and hope that everything works? Well, if you're here in this DevOps meetup, you know that that's not the best way to do things, right? Because it generates some challenges. When you have infrastructure that you need to replicate to multiple environments, it can generate a lot of problems. Some of them is difficulty. It's making it more difficult, the process of designing and testing whatever you want to build, right? In this case, we're building API specifications, we're building policies, we're building a lot of things associated to APIs themselves. So finding errors earlier, it's a little bit complicated to do if you don't have a comprehensive process to go through. Deployment becomes a problem as well, right? Deploying continuously to multiple environments when you're handling infrastructure code can be a little complicated. There are a lot of processes going out there. Okay, I'm going to talk about one of them. There are a lot of them going on out there, how to handle infrastructure as code in a DevOps same environment. But people realize that it's something that's really needed, right? Having immutable infrastructure is something that's really good for your, not only your software development lifecycle, but any type of development lifecycle that you have on your hands. And that complicates a little bit more when you're talking about operations. How do you guarantee that process continuity? How do you guarantee that things are going to move forward the same way all of the time, right? To minimize the amount of errors that you get. When you fix all of these problems, right, you start getting early feedback from developers, from users, right, from people who are going to approve these APIs from going from development to production. And early feedback is much more convenient for developers and reduce a lot of risks and costs, if you think about it. As early as you can in your pipeline, as you can identify deviations from your standards, the faster you can resolve them. And finally, because of that, we get to APIOps, right? How do we scale to operations this process that is centralized, is meant for us to manage all of our APIs and make them work quite well? How do we add DevOps to this process? The solution that I'm providing to you right now, that I'm suggesting to you right now, is called APIOps. So in a proper API deployment process, right, what we're calling is the process of creating your API lifecycle in Azure API Management. When you add DevOps to that process, you, of course, combine the development and operations, and you unite every single person who is working on both of these fronts in application planning, development, delivery, and operations. That sometimes for infrastructure as a service is not enough. And there's a process that allows you to facilitate that DevOps process when we're talking about infrastructure as a code, which is called GitOps. And GitOps is an operational framework that takes all of the best practices from DevOps that are used in application development, such as version control, collaboration, compliance, CI/CD, and applies them to infrastructure automation. It's pretty similar, but you see some nuances here and there. And together, right, we have APIOps. APIOps overall is a methodology that applies the concepts of GitOps and DevOps to API deployment. And much like DevOps, APIOps also helps team members easily make changes. I don't like the word easily, right? But I'm gonna say it here. But for some people, it can be easy because they're doing this for years, but for others, it can be a little complicated in the beginning. But it makes it easier to make changes to your environment, in this case, Azure API Management, and deploy them in an iterative and automated way. Okay? And with that, when you have that completed, you enable everyone involved with self-service and automated tools, you increase speed, and you increase the quality of your products as well. So in a nutshell, okay, APIOps will place the Azure API Management infrastructure under version control to achieve these goals. Okay, whether they're making changes directly into API management, most operations will happen through code changes. Okay, and these code changes are easier to be reviewed and audited in an automated process by using Git. Also, the more APIs that you build and deploy by following this approach, the greater the consistency between APIs will be. Okay, and with greater consistency, it's less likely that your service can or won't be consumed because of low quality. Okay, so as everything DevOps related, as everything infrastructure as code related, it has a learning curve, but once you get there, you will save a lot of time and money on your processes. Now, we have two different processes that happen here, right? And I'm going to explain both of them to you. The first one is the design and deployment phase, which is done by developers, people who are developing the APIs. You need to create the design spec of the API specification, the policies. They need to set up Git. They need to set up a Git repository and set up Git in their environment to start using it. They push those changes in the API management platform to that Git repository. They check out a branch from that repository and start making those changes that they want. Create new APIs, remove APIs, add operations, remove operations, add policies, remove policies. And after they merge that change back to their main branch on Git, they run pipelines. In this particular case, on the demo that I'm sharing with you today, we're going to run these pipelines in GitHub Actions. Those pipelines can also be run in Azure DevOps if you choose to do so. But you run the pipelines, and then the pipelines will deploy those changes to multiple environments: development, QA, testing, pre-production, production, staging, whatever you want to call them. The second process that we have is more related to operations. That's the operations process. Because the first thing that you need to do once you create your APIs in the portal, if you start creating APIs in the portal, is extract the information that is there already for you to use, right? So the first thing that you want to do is extract the infrastructure configuration from Azure API management, okay? You want to update the infrastructure via code, review the changes, and deploy to multiple environments. So at some point there, those processes, they are similar, but the beginning can be quite different, okay? If you choose to use a different approach to it. And how does this work in a proper flow, right? So bear with me here, there's a lot going on. I'll try to explain the best way possible to you. It'll make more sense when we go through the demo. But the first thing that we need to understand here, we have all of the actors that we have seen before. They are here. We have the API developers, people who create the APIs, and we have API operators, which what we're showing here are the people who are going to be adding flavor to those APIs inside Azure API management, right? They're responsible for designing, creating, and testing open API specifications. API operators are responsible for adding policies, logging, diagnostics, everything that you can add on an API to make it more robust, right? They can be the same person, they can be the same team, they can be different teams, it doesn't really matter, all right? But the responsibilities are a little different here and there. You have your Git repository, and the Git repository has your API definition. You have your Azure API management policies, you have the API service information, product logger and diagnostics, everything that is needed for you to deploy your APIs the best way possible, right? Inside Azure API management. You have a couple of Git actions here, pull requests and merge, right? Pull requests is when you make a change to a particular branch and you want to merge it back to your main branch, for example. You create a pull request for that for it to be approved, and you merge it later. We also have a couple of pieces here called the extractor pipeline, which is a tool that we use. It's actually a pipeline, it's not a tool. It's a tool inside a pipeline that extracts the data from your API management configuration and pushes it, right? Commits it to Git, to your Git repository. And you also have the publisher pipeline. The publisher pipeline does the opposite, right? The publisher pipeline, what it does is it picks up the information for your Git repository and pushes it back to your API management instances. It doesn't matter how many you have. So to summarize, the first thing that happens is API operators will run the extractor pipeline to synchronize the Git repository with the API management instance, and will populate the Git repository with API management objects in the required format. YAML, JSON, doesn't matter. If any API changes are detected in the API management instance from what you see in the GitHub repo, a pull request is automatically created for operators to review. So you made changes to your API management instance, you're extracting it here, and you notice changes, right? So someone did some changes directly into the API management instance, right? Maybe that's something that you don't want people to do, or maybe that's okay, but there's a process to handle that. That generates a PR automatically that is validated by API operators. They validate, they say if it's okay or not to have that. If a developer, API developers will, when they want to change an API, they will clone the Git repository, create a branch, and create API definitions using open API specifications or any tool of their choice, okay? When they push changes to the repository, a pull request is also created for validation, okay? That pull request can be automatically approved or reviewed, okay, depending on the level of control that is required for people to use it. So if you have changes on your API specification, you can have someone there to go and look and see if everything's correct. They will deploy that to, let's say, a QA environment or a development environment that will be tested, and then they will approve something, that particular deployment to go to production, just like a DevOps process for software development. So after the changes are approved and merged into the main branch, we have what we call publishing pipeline, which is going to use the publisher tool to deploy the latest changes to the API management instances, okay? API operators at this point can create and modify API management policies, diagnostics, products, and other relevant objects, and then commit the changes. The changes are then reviewed, and they're merged after approval. After merging all of the changes, the publishing pipeline will also deploy the changes by using the API definition process. So you see that there's a couple of ways here. We have a couple of vectors and a couple of ways that you can update that API management instance, right? And the ways that you can do it is either by code, which is the recommended way, or also by using the portal and changing the API management instance using the portal, right? And then running the extractor pipeline to get that configuration and start changing it via code from there, okay? Just a couple of options that you have here to handle this particular pipeline. Now, I'm pretty sure some of you are already familiar with the GitHub flow, right? It's a flow that is heavily used for software application for software development, right? When you have teams that are spread around, you have multiple people, when you want to make sure that you have a centralized location to handle those codes, understand the changes, and have a proper process to get approved or denied. The GitHub flow is only one of the many branching strategies that you see on the market. But since it's the simplest one that I believe to exist, that's the one that we have chose to use in this APIOps process, right? And it has been chosen to be used in the GitOps process. So basically we have your main branch, and the idea of the main branch here for some organizations is that everything that is in the main branch can or could go to production. Doesn't mean that you're going to deploy it, but it's valid enough. It was tested, it was validated, and can go to production if you choose to do so. If you need to create a new feature, for example, a new API or a new API operation, the process is you create a new branch from that main branch. We'll call that a feature branch. You give it any name you want. You start working on it, and then you merge it back to main by using a pull request. All right. Once that pull request is approved, that pipeline, it will trigger a pipeline on GitHub Actions in this particular case. Again, you can use Azure DevOps if you want to do as well, or you can build your own using other tools for CI/CD that you have there. But in our particular case here on the demo, we're going to be running some GitHub Actions pipelines to validate that information, deploy it in both environments, development and production. And then it's going to deploy in any environment that we want. Okay, so hopefully that was clear. It was good for you to understand, right? I would like to share a demo with you here, which I believe is going to make things even clearer for you. But let's start by doing this. One second. So I want to show you a couple of things here before we start, right? The first thing that I want to show you is the GitHub repo that we have created for this particular demo. The GitHub repo has a few things that are pretty important. At the beginning, it's only going to have a couple of workflows for you to use. So when you're starting to use API management, at the same time you create a Git, it can be a GitHub repo, it can be any type of repo that you want using Git. That's only going to have the pipelines associated to your APIOps pipeline, right? After that, you're going to run the extractor pipeline, the extractor pipeline, who's going to be collecting that information from Azure API Management, as I shared with you before. As you see here in this presentation, the extractor pipeline is going to collect information from Azure API Management and push it, right, committed to our branch here, our feature branch. And it's going to create a pull request for us to approve, and that will be shared to the main branch. Okay. The other one that we have, the other pipeline that we have is the publisher pipeline, who's going to do the other process, right? Who's going to pick up things that we have on our main branch and then publish it to our Azure API Management instances. Okay, that's what the extractor and publisher pipelines will do. But there are a couple of things we can do here to get this working, right? I have two Azure API Management instances right now, and they're virtually the same at this point because they were created using APIOps. So they're virtually the same at this point. They both have the Echo API and the Star Wars API, right? If you need me to zoom in a little bit, just give me a thumbs up or come out of mute and say it. I can zoom in a little bit. But if it's good for you to see, it's good enough too. So the first thing that I want to do here, I want to go to my development environment and I want to create a new API. Okay, and I want to create a new API from the portal because I want you to see the extractor pipeline running. Now let's create a new API here. I'm going to create an API from an open API specification to get things going quicker. I'm going to use one that probably knows me by name right now because I have done this particular process 1,000 times. It's called calculator API. It's a basic calculator API. Okay, I'm going to create a suffix for my API here. I'm going to say that it can be called both from HTTP and HTTPS. You see here, we're already enforcing standards. If you have a standard that says only HTTPS calls can be made to my APIs, right? Even if you have an HTTP API as a backend, you can enforce that HTTPS call here. Okay, so we're already enforcing standards here in a seamless way. I'm going to create an API suffix for it. It's going to be calc. I'm going to add to a couple of products. We have this concept of products on Azure API management that I'm not going to go too deep into it right now, but you can use it to group APIs together for different consumers. And I believe that's it. Stick around for a little bit, create my API. So now my API has been created from an open API specification. So it already has a bunch of operations associated to it, right? With the parameters on how to call it, etc. I'm not going to bother with that a lot at this point. So what I'm going to do, since I've done this on my development environment, the first thing that I want to do right now, I want to go back to my pipeline and run my extractor tool. And my extractor tool is going to be the one who's going to pick up all those changes that I have created in that pipeline, and is going to create a pull request for me saying, hey, we've had changes in this particular Azure API management instance. Do you want to deploy them in multiple environments? Yes or no? So we have the extract process going on at this point. We can come inside here and take a look at the logs as they are generated in real time for us. If we ever get a hosted runner to pick it up. It's taking a little bit of time to pick up a hosted runner. GitHub Actions, the way that it works, you have runners, Linux, macOS, Windows that are hosted by GitHub itself. And you can use them to run your pipelines, but you can also use self-hosted runners if you choose to do so. They're usually faster than this. So maybe something happened at this point. Let's give it a couple of minutes. Oh, there you go. So right now it's doing what it needs to do. It's going to my API management instance. It's picking up my information, and it created an artifact, and now it's creating the pull request for that particular artifact. All right, pull request created, job completed. If I go to my pull request here, I will be able to see the changes that were made to the files, right? In this particular place, I had 6 file changes. I had a lot of files changes here. So I had the basic calculator API. I had some information changed on the API JSON here and a couple of products for the Star Wars API, which is fine. But here's the one that I wanted to show you, right? So we created the new specifications for my API management instance. From my API management instance, right? So great, I have this here. Now, second thing that I need to do at this point is Now that I have this here, I can do a couple of things, right? This PR was created without any type of actions on top of it, meaning that there's no linting, there's no security checks, there's nothing associated to it. In a proper DevOps process, we would do that. We will make sure that we're following patterns. We're making sure that we're following security standards. We're making sure that we're doing a lot of different things before even making sure that this PR could be merged into my main branch. We're not doing anything right now, but you could do a lot of things here, okay, to add to your DevOps process. You can use testing pipelines. You can do a lot of different things here. You can go really crazy in what you're trying to do with this pipeline. In this particular case, I just want to merge my pull request because I'm a brave guy. And the pull request was merged. Once that pull request was merged, let's take a look here at our diagram and see what's going to happen now. After the pull request is merged, what happens is the publisher pipeline kicks in and deploys those changes in all of my environments, if I choose to do so. Let's see this running here. If I go to actions, I know that I have this pipeline running right now. I see that this pipeline right now is deploying my changes to dev. It failed for some reason. Okay. That's a new one. Of course, you run this 1,000 times, right?
Got to update.
Of course it's gonna fail. Of course it's gonna fail when you're live. I ran this probably 5 times today. Let's run it again.
It's a changing world.
Yeah. This has been happening quite a lot with me. My demos have been failing on live experiments quite a lot. I should record videos for them.
I think 40 is a handshake failure. It might be a timing issue.
Yeah. It was taking a little bit of time to pick up that runner. So maybe it's related to that. Okay. Okay, we're past that step. So in a good environment, you would go and check what that error was, okay? Since I know that this worked because I ran it 1,000 times, I'm just gonna go past it right now. So what it's doing right now, it is basically picking up those changes that I have in code format, JSON file, YAML files, and it is building that pipeline and is creating, using the publisher pipeline to push that to my environments. It pushed to my development environment already, because I have 2 environments here that I should have told you before. I have 2 environments here, development and production, also on GitHub, right? It was pushed to my development environment, but now I want to push it to production. But production, of course, is a gated environment, right? So I need to approve that pending deployment, but I don't want to do that right now. I want to go to my development environment and see if everything's still here, right? Maybe something's broken, maybe something's not working, maybe my APIs are not there anymore. Maybe there's something that I need to take a look here and see if it's missing. All right, I still have my basic calculator, my Echo API, my Star Wars API. So everything seems good. I would run a lot of tests here before moving this to production, but let's pretend that I did them and that I'm ready to deploy them to production. I'm going to prove and deploy. Now, the same pipeline that ran for development is going to run for production. And if you see here correctly, my production environment only has 2 APIs at this point, Echo API and the Star Wars API. Let's wait for it to run. Yeah, it's much slower than it was yesterday and this afternoon. It's usually like it's blazing fast. I had to do a GitHub Actions workshop once, and GitHub Actions, the APIs were offline. So you can imagine how fun that was, right? Not being able to run the workshop properly. But all right, now we have built that particular pipeline. We're gonna check here first all of the changes that were done on this environment. Let's take a look here to see the API. So same process that we did in development, we're done in production, okay? Pick up those files from the main repository, publish them to our development environment, pick up those files from our main branch, and push them to our production environment on Azure API Management. And here, as you can see right now, I've updated already. I have the 3 APIs updated, right? So by using APIOps, by using infrastructure as code right within APIOps, I was able to maintain the integrity between my development environment and my production environment, okay? Now, is it okay if I take an extra 5 minutes? Because I wanted to show how to do this to code too, because that's the best way to do it. Is it okay if I take an extra five minutes for this demo?
Sure.
Okay, thank you so much. Now, I've showed you how to do it by doing changes using the API portal, the API management portal. Let's do it like developers do it, right? Let's open Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code, as I talked to you before, what you have here is a representation of my GitHub repository that I have with my API specifications here. I have merged a couple of changes, so I'm going to do that again. I'm going to do a pull here first, just to get the latest from my environment. And as you can see here, I have my 3 APIs, right? Again, if you need me to zoom in, just come out of mute and let me know to zoom in, okay? I have my 3 APIs here, base calculator, echo API, and Star Wars API. And what I want to do something simpler now. I don't want to add a new API. I just want to add a new operation to my API. So I can come to my basic calculator API, for example, and I can take a look at the specification that it has. And I have a YAML file here. If I'm very well versed, I can understand what's going on here. If I'm not that well versed and I want to see how this is going to look on a Swagger representation, a Swagger file, sorry, button, I can use the OpenAPI extension, API extension from Visual Studio Code, best IDE in the world, by the way. I can use that to look at the OpenAPI specification for the API that I have just created, right? So, which is going to be not the Star Wars one, but I want to look at the basic calculator. Okay, so I have, I can add, I can subtract, I can multiply, and I can divide without any issues here. I want to add a new operation to this. I want to come here and I want to use the same extension to create a new operation. And I can do that right here. I have all of my paths that I have for every single operation that I already have, and I want to create a new one. I can come here and say, add a new path. And it's going to create a new path for me in the specification itself, and I can start working with it. So the first thing that I want to do, I want to call it mod, right? I want to make sure that I run a mod operation here, that I collect the remainder of a division for my users. There are a couple of things that I can do here. The first thing that I want to do, I want to add a summary to it. So this is a get operation, right? I want to add a summary to it. Returns the remainder of the division. For the description, I'm going to do the same thing. For parameters, I'm going to copy what I have here on my division because it's exactly the same thing, right? Oh, I missed a step here. I forgot to create the new branch to do this. I'm doing everything on the main branch, and that's a big no-no, okay? For a lot of software development lifecycle, that's a big no-no. So I'm going to undo everything that I've done so far just to make sure that I have a clean main branch here to work with. And I'm going to create a branch just to do this process, right? Let me move this guy here at the top. So I have a command here to do it. Yeah, there you go. So I'm going to create a new branch, right? I'm going to check out a new branch, create a new branch here locally first, and then do it remotely. But I'm going to call this branch feature add mod path. Okay. Okay, now I can do my changes. I can come back here, my Open API specification. I can add my new path. I start from scratch. Following best practices, right? Same thing, I'm gonna add a summary to it. Returns the remainder of a division. Not summary. 4 parameters, as I was mentioned before, I'm just going to copy the ones that I have here and return responses as well. All right. There's something wrong here. Okay, all right. Just I'll do formatting. Put the parameters here, save them. I see that I have a couple of errors here that I can fix if I want to. I see that I don't have a description for my return responses here from the API that I have created from the Open API specification. That's a problem from the Open API specification that I used, right? If I want to fix that, I can add something here for the return response if I choose to do so. It's not mandatory. I just want to remove these red markers from my operations. Okay. All right. Now I have my API here. Should be working quite well. Let's see what we can do with it, right? So the first thing that I want to do right now, I want to make sure that I did the correct changes, right? I'm going to run a git status here to see the files that I have changed. I've changed the specification for the basic calculator. I'm going to add that file. So Git understands that that's what I want to commit right now, and I'm going to commit those changes to my repository, to the branch that I have created. So adding mods operation to calculator API. Perfect. Now I can basically do a git push, and it's going to fail because that remote branch doesn't exist anymore, but it's going to give me exactly the command that I need that I'm too lazy to type on my own. So if you don't know Git right now, I have created if you don't know Git too well, right, to this point, what I did was I created a branch locally, and now I am pushing that branch to my remote repository on GitHub. Perfect. It's here, it's done. I don't need to do anything else in this place. So the only thing that I could do, just to make sure that I have it properly set, I could come back here to my Open API specification and see visually how that mod operation looks, right? So that I have created. So I've created a mod, it returns the remainder of a division. It has my 2 parameters. I think we're good to go. Perfect. Let's go back to GitHub right now. So at this point, if I come here to pull requests, GitHub is going to tell me exactly that my new feature branch has a new change, right? That I can compare and create a pull request from. But that's what I'm going to do. That's the process. Again, now I'm doing this process here. API developers change things on GitHub repos by creating new branches, and then they create pull requests for people to validate and deploy using the publisher pipeline into API management instances. Okay, so let's create the pull request. That's a very bad pull request. I'm not explaining anything here. If you're doing this on your own, make sure to add some more information. I'm going to merge that pull request, confirm the merge, and delete the branch. After I merge it, what happens is the publisher pipeline kicks in automatically for me. All right, so both of my environments we'll have that new operation here at some point. Let's see how this is going. All right, I have a new publisher API going on from the new commit that I have just created. It's publishing it to dev, it's gonna publish it to production, right? We don't need to wait because the process is exactly the same. I just wanted to show you another way to do it, okay? Well, while I'm doing this, let me share something with you here. We have a very comprehensive step-by-step for you to follow, and I'm going to share those links with you later for you to follow. If you want to reuse this APIOps process that I have created, you can do it either on GitHub Actions or Azure DevOps. Remember, this is an open source project, so if you have any other CI/CD tool there that you want to use, you can also create your own extractor pipelines and publisher pipelines for these particular tools and use them here, and maybe publish them back to the repository itself, also people can use it too, right? How great would that be? But here's going to give you every single piece of information that you need to replicate this process, right? How to set up on Azure DevOps, how to set up on GitHub, how to run the extractor pipeline, how to run the publisher pipeline, how to support independent teams if you want to do so, right? This process is extremely flexible. It fits a lot of different development life cycles and environments and teams that you may have on your organization or your own if you want to work with it. So I would suggest you take a look at this here to run this process on your own, okay? While I was showing you that, I have deployed it to my development environment. So hopefully once I update this, I should be able to see my new operation. And there you go. My mod operation returns the remainder of two files, two numbers after the division, right? Perfect. So what I can do now, we don't need to show that because you've seen it before, but now I can approve my production deployment, and then I'm going to have the same infrastructure deployed on my production environment as well. Okay, so that was the demo that I wanted to show you. Hopefully that was clear enough. Now we're back at the end here. Two ways that you can use this. Now, I don't have this on my presentation for you, but I have two advices for you, right? If you choose to use this at some point, it's better to go through the coding process, right? Because it's easier to keep things consistent if you pick only one process for doing things, right? So just make sure that you follow one process, and if you need to choose one process, make sure that you use the coding process for developers instead of changing things in the API development portal, right? API management portal. Sorry, you can start creating your APIs in the API management portal if you choose to do so, no problems, right? But at some point, try to make that change to the coding platform. Second thing is, I have been involved in many DevOps transformations throughout my career. Many. I can't count, can't remember how many. And I have to tell you something that you probably know already since you've been in this meetup for a while, so you probably have some DevOps experience. DevOps for me, those are my numbers. They're 50% technology and 50% process. So that process, one thing that you cannot live without is a comprehensive playbook on how these things are being deployed and how to use this process step by step. Create this to facilitate your development experience, because if you introduce a new process like this without comprehensive documentation that people can follow until they create that muscle and keep continuing it on their own, right, without any issues, you will have problems. You will have a bad time. Okay. But then again, thank you so much for listening to me here. It took me like an hour and 10 minutes to go over this presentation with a demo, so thank you so much for bearing with me here. This is my contact information if you want to follow me and connect on LinkedIn, if you want to follow my GitHub. And if you like very bad watercoloring, you can follow me on Instagram as well. I haven't posted in a while, but I will accept you there if you follow me. Just don't laugh at my drawings because I like doing them. So yeah, I just shared this because maybe you like watercolor too and you want to talk to me about it. Right. A couple of links at the topic here, at the top here for you to follow as well. The first one is the APIOps lab that I just showed you, that I'm going to also share with you on the chat here. I'm going to share this link on the chat with you here. So if you want to build your own APIOps process there on your environment, that's the process to follow. Zoom is too complicated for me to find the chat at this point, but I will. I promise you I will. There you go. And the second link is the lab that you can follow to learn more about Azure API management, okay? If you choose to use Azure API management, I would suggest you to run the first lab first so you can understand the basics of it until you reach the APIOps process, all right? But other than that, thank you so much for your patience, for your time. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you found this useful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Fernando.
No problem. It should be here to help. I see a couple of questions here.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions in the chat window. Slava asked a question. Can you share any real-world examples or case studies where organizations have successfully implemented API ops principles to streamline their API deployment processes? And what were the key factors that contributed to their success?
That's a great question, Slava, right? So I touched a little bit on that. Let me raise my desk here because I've been seeing for a while. I like to stand up sometimes. I touched on that subject a little bit during our presentation, right? I have been working with many customers here in Canada to help them achieve this for the past year and a half. I'm not going to name them particularly because we only name customers who agree to have their use cases shared. But yes, I do have a lot of success stories of people who have been using APIOps constantly there, sometimes with by using this process, sometimes by using other tools to manage infrastructure, right? But the APIOps process, combining DevOps and GitOps, it's there, right? So I can think out of my head here 4 different big customers in Canada that I have helped and are following this process for the past year and a half. So there are a lot of use cases that I could share without naming them, right? And the key factors that contributed to their success, and that's the thing that I always share with them, right? I always talk to customers about 2 main things. Those are my things, right? Things that I like here when I'm talking about Azure to customers. The first one is enterprise integration, which is a practice that also is usually centralized within organizations. And the second one is DevOps, also a process that is usually centralized within organizations. And they're both very similar in a way that technology is there to help you. You can use any type of tools that you want. The people that I have seen to have a lot of success in these environments are people who have dedicated teams for DevOps, right? And they can also be responsible for APIOps operations. Or you can separate people within teams to do this particular things, right? Second piece that I would always mention to them to make sure that they have a proper way, not only to build, but to operationalize this process is, again, playbooks. Playbooks, in my case, if I were to have my own, if I was the manager of a DevOps team, I would make sure that we build a very comprehensive set of documentation, playbooks and runbooks to share with people and say, hey, if you're creating an API in this way, this is how you do it. If you're creating an API that way, this is how you do it. These are the tools that we have. These are the policies that we're going to apply automatically for you. These are the policies that you can apply on your own. Make sure that you understand that the security processes are X, Y, and Z. So basically playbooks, dedicated teams, right? And changes in chunks, right? Do small batches for changes, right? Involve a couple of teams at first, prove that concept, because once you prove that concept with 2 teams, 3 teams, depending on the size of your organization, it's much easier to share that knowledge with other people. All right, so those are the key factors that I would share with you to make sure that you have a successful process there.
Excellent. Thanks, Fernando. Looks like we got one more question. Willie has asked if there's any recommendations on versioning of APIs.
That's a very complicated question to answer. We're talking about APIs.
Yeah.
Semantic versioning here, I see it here, right? Semantic versioning.
Semantic, yes.
Yeah, it's great for software, etc. You will find people who use semantic versioning internally for APIs. When they publish the APIs externally to people, you see that they usually have that path that starts with V1, and then what you're trying to do, V2, V3, V4. That's how people usually do versioning, right? Using APIs. There are multiple different ways to do it. There's no right or wrong answer. All of them are great for some reasons and horrible for other reasons, right? So there's no particular way that I see people doing API versioning. You see articles all over the place around it. But what I can tell you is it doesn't matter the path that you choose to version, your API management tool needs to be the one who handles that versioning for you, right? You don't want to do that individually for APIs themselves. There's a concept, I don't want to get too deep into it, but we have the concept of, when we're talking about APIs, revisions and versions, right? Revisions for small breaking changes and versions for immutable changes to go to production. That's also not a rule, right? There are people who do things differently too. So unfortunately, there's no consensus in the API world on how to handle API version.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Like a common problem, but it's not technical, really.
A common problem. Everyone handles it separately. If you go to Reddit's API, they handle it in one way. If you go to Facebook's API, they handle it another way. One thing that I can tell you right now is an API management tool. It helps you a lot with that because you can keep versions running, right? Until you choose to
deprecate them.
Deprecate them.
Yeah.
It helps a lot with A/B scenarios, for example, etc. So you can leverage Azure API management or any type of API management tool there. They all support API versioning.
Yeah, as lifecycle management, what you commit to your customers and those APIs.
Yeah. It's a fun topic always.
Yes.
Any other questions?
There are no other questions in the chat line. If there are any further questions, please put them in the chat or come on off mute and ask them directly.
Yeah. Oh, one thing that I haven't mentioned, right? If you need help or if you need some type of any other deeper documentation that I could share with you about this topic or any other topic regarding API management or enterprise integration overall, just let me know. I'm happy to talk to you about that. Those are my they're my top 3 favorite topics to talk about.
Yeah, your passions. Gotcha.
Yes. You need to have them.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's it. Willie, do you have any closing remarks?
No, none for me. Apologies from Andre Fernando. He lost internet connectivity.
Oh, okay.
At the same time, I saw quite a few others drop as well. So I don't know if it's a region that they pulled the power cord.
Hit by lightning or...
Well, it's sunny outside.
Or all of a sudden, good weather.
No problem. Hopefully he'll be able to see the recording later. But again, I just want to take the opportunity to thank you all for the invitation. I think it's great to do things like this. Sharing the knowledge is always fun. And I'll make sure to be here as a participant for the next one and the next one.
Well,
Awesome.
Looking forward to that. And thank you very much to you as well, Fernando, for a really interesting session.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't answer my versioning, but I know it's a complex headache that we've been fighting with for.
If you find an answer to it, at some point, I would love to know as well, because I could never find that answer.
Just develop the perfect API the first time and you never need to version it.
That's it.
Yeah, the never-changing API.
Never change anything from flow to double.
Carve it in stone. You're good.
Yeah. Carbon fiber API.
Yeah, one more thing that I can tell you, if you have the ability to not handle any number like in decimal format or dates in different formats, you will have a better time versioning APIs, because those are the main culprits sometimes for problems within API versioning. So yeah, that's an advice that I can give you. Nobody can follow, but it's an advice I can give you anyway. Again, thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks, Fernando.
No problem. Happy to be here.
Really, really fascinating topic.
All right, Martin, I'm going to stop the recording.